Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Justin Chadwick. He's a man of many parts, as I've discovered, and some of those are automotive, as we were chatting about his TR4 and my MGB earlier. His is going, mine is not. So Justin holds a PhD in history from the University of Adelaide, and he's taught both there and at the University of South Australia. I said he's a man of many parts. He's worked in the book trade and the automotive industry. As Rajiv has pointed out, apart from outstanding research and analytical skills, he has experience in business management, sales, marketing and procurement. Today's address, in fact, is going to address some dimensions of those multifaceted interests. As you'll discover, Justin's got an inquisitive mind, and he's a lifelong learner who enjoys embracing change and challenges. Now, before we get there, I'll just organise our presentation. Any moment now. Right, stand by. Oh. Okay, I haven't got speaker's view, but anyway, I'm sure you'll be able to track through that, Justin. Without any further ado, can I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Justin Chadwick.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. It's very, very kind of you to say those things. It's not what everyone says about me. Now, just before I start, I'd like to say that this presentation today is a spin-off of some research I did when I was doing my PhD, which is in, of all things, trade unionism at Holden's in South Australia. It's a pretty dry subject, so this is actually a little bit more interesting. But what I found is that the work which I did for that thesis, which was based upon the archive at the State Library of South Australia, is totally under-accessed. We have a few histories, which are very populist histories by people which probably know Don Loeffler, for instance, in South Australia. But for our actual history of Holden's in South Australia, we don't have anything really on a scholarly nature. And this is a shame, and I think that it's something which we should try to address in the future, because if we don't have our scholars looking at Australian history, then no one else will, which is something which we really need to be aware of. So what we'll do here is I'll just give you very briefly a rundown of the Imperial trade preference scheme through this presentation and its impact on a number of South Australian companies primarily. So, sorry, but we cannot supply is a phrase which the companies Holden's and also TJ Richards, which was another motor bodybuilder in South Australia in the mid-30s, heard quite often. So in 1935, hang on, let me just get, there we go. In 1935, General Motors in the United States introduced the innovative all-steel turret top design motor body. As we can see here, we've got a couple of gents in their baseball kits standing on top. Now, previously, most cars weren't like this, as you probably know. The design by GM's... Is this a bit too loud? Got too much feedback? It's not working. Well, while he's doing this, while we have the technical details, I'll continue so we don't do... So designed by GM's Fisher Body division was a dramatic move away from the wooden frame construction typical of the motor body manufacturers to date. By pressing a one-piece roof, the car was given greater strength, rigidity and safety features. No longer could canvas roofs tear or leak, something which Steve and I are both probably aware of. Letting in the elements, and with a fully enclosed cabin, the driving experience became considerably quieter. Branded by GM as the Uni Steel turret top, the new design body was pressed in one process using huge sheets of deep, wide-drawing mild steel. The roof was then welded to the steel body panels and finished with strengthening U-shaped steel members. The finished body was stronger and more rigid than any previous design, and allowed motor body stylists to introduce a vast new array of designs hitherto unachievable. The new Uni Steel body was set for introduction in Australian production for the 1937 models and drew considerable press attention when they were announced. However, local manufacturers such as Holden's and TJ Richards, I'm sure we'll let you have a look at that first for a little while, TJ Richards in South Australia were faced with a dilemma of accessing suitable material to make the new design. Steel used in motor body panels is particular and is not simply rolled off any steel mill. It must be soft, allowing to be pressed easily. The dies used must be able to press out thousands of exactly the same panels, and the harder the material used, the more stress it places on the dies, wearing them out and thus requiring maintenance or replacement. The use of soft material ensures longevity of dies and also leads load on the presses themselves, allowing greater output per hour and therefore greater profitability. Now, as you can see here on this slide, these are motor bodies built in 1935 by Holden's. This is from a Holden plant down at Woodville. As you see there, we have the typical motor body, which was a canvas top roof. Just so you know that up until the introduction of this kind of vehicle, and also after the Second World War in Australia actually started making a proper car, engines were imported from overseas. No, there was no car like we think of a car today. They were made in parts. An engine would come in, a chassis would come in, they'd be put together. And then the motor body, which was being built by Holden's or TJ Richards or a number of other companies around Australia, but dominated by Holden's and TJ Richards, were assembled. Now, initially, when you wanted a car, such as the first cars which were ever made in Australia and internationally, you would put an order in for the design you wanted, the colour exactly, and all the fittings and fixtures. So there was no commonality at all except for what is the chassis and the running gear. So you had total choice. So cars which were built up until the mid-30s or so late 20s, they were very, very different. So today you have exactly the same model coming off millions at a time, potentially. That did not happen. The introduction of mass production in motor vehicle manufacture, such as what happened in Australia later on after the Second World War, is when you had commonality of design. Right, let's move on. Sorry for a little aside. Okay, so the Uni Steel Design used the steel, the same as other panels, but the major difference was the size of sheet required to press the roof in one process. And this is where things came unstuck. As you can imagine, you couldn't put this kind of load on top of a canvas roof car. So this is a demonstration down at Woodville, again, to show you the strength of a full steel body car. So significant changes were afoot. Now, the other advantage, of course, with a full steel body car is you can increase engine capacity as well, which means you get more power, faster, longer, everything which car drivers tended to want. Panel material was made in Australia in large quantities as steelmakers panel material was not made in Australia in large quantities as steelmakers had not tooled up yet, concentrating on other areas such as corrugated galvanised sheet for the building industry. This meant Australian bodybuilders relied on imports for the panel material requirements, with the old, smaller body panels like doors or bonnets. This did not present a problem. English steel mills had been supplying the Australian market for years, with extra supply coming from US mills. But with a new, larger turret top design, the sizes required changed. Normally, this would not have been a problem. The local bodybuilders would have ordered suppliers from the steel mill that could manufacture their requirements. However, and this is where things get a little sticky, the Australian manufacturers were constrained by government legislation that demanded their supplies from within the Empire, that's the British Empire, and in this case, from British steel mills. This ordinarily would not have been a problem, but in this instance, two issues arose. Firstly, the British were desperately rebuilding their defence equipment, in particular their motorised transport, and secondly, the steel sheet being manufactured in England was, according to John Story, the Director of Manufacturing at Holden's, of inferior quality. So how did they come to the position where the Australian bodies were forced to buy British? It all began with the British desire for preferential trade within the empire. This was a nascent trading bloc that was to protect mainly British secondary industry producers from the rise of countries such as the United States and Germany. The empire was large enough to form a self-contained trading bloc that could move primary produce from places such as Australia to Britain for processing with return flow of secondary goods. Not really much difference from the colonial experience particularly. This is formalised at a number of imperial conferences, the first being in 1902, where the conference resolved to facilitate commercial intercourse to strengthen the empire. This was followed by the 1917 Imperial War Conference that resolved to encourage the development of imperial resources and especially to making the empire independent of other countries in respect to food supplies, raw materials and essential industries. At the height of the Depression, the 1930 Imperial Conference reiterated the resolutions of previous conferences with continued support from the Australian government. Senator Carroll of Western Australia, speaking in the Senate in May 1930, advocated the increase of inter-imperial trade and economic unity through the adoption of a comprehensive system of reciprocal preference calculated to preserve and expand the particular and essential industries of each section of the empire. The sentiment was endorsed by the British parliamentarians, with the member for Macclesfield, John Reamer, stating in the House of Commons that the empire be developed as a single economic unit with internal free trade as the ideal. Sir Robert Horne, the one-time Chancellor of the Exchequer, told the Commons that the Dominion markets had not developed yet and needed and preferred British-made goods. This, of course, is somewhat dubious, particularly when dealing with Australia and cars, since Australia at the time was the biggest motor body producer in the world outside of the United States. So bear that in mind. The following conference in 1932 resulted in the UK and Australia trade agreement, which was a trade diversion policy coming into effect in 1936. A reciprocal agreement that saw Australian goods, primary produce, given preference in entering Britain, with Australia doing the same for British goods. This was all well and good, but for the local bodybuilders it spelt potential disaster. There was, though, the ability to apply for a licence granted by the Minister for Trade and Customs. There he is. The moment the government announced the licensing system, requests flooded into the Customs Department by motor bodybuilders who had steel orders with the US steel mills. In a letter to the Comptroller General of Customs, Edwin Abbott, the Managing Director of Armco Steel Company, R. Conroy, made application to import a suitable steel sheet for car bodies which are beyond the rolling limits of English steel mills. Abbott then began a process that infuriated the Australian bodybuilders and resulted in unemployment in the industry. Rather than allowing the licences, Abbott, following the letter of the trade diversion policy, requested investigation into the possibility of local supply or whether they could be purchased in Britain or Europe, but not the United States. This begs the question of why would the local manufacturers be asking for a licence if they could source or manufacture locally already? The only possible local producer was Lysat, the company, an English mill subsidiary, and they announced in June 1936 that they intended to expand the Newcastle works, that's Newcastle in New South Wales, to produce motor body steel. This, though, would take time to come online, and the response to the bodybuilders was for them to source from Britain until then. Even when the South Australian Premier, Richard Butler, at the request of Holden's, approached the Prime Minister on the issue, he was told that all requirements would be met from English mills. Abbott was informed in July 1936 that due to increasing rearmament demands, there was no way the British mills would be able to guarantee supply. These delays by the end of the year began to impact production. Writing to the Minister for Trade Treaties, Henry Gullett, the General Manager of Ruskin Motor Bodies, A.C. Mitchell, said that an order placed with Armco in Britain would not depart the factory until a fortnight after its initial delivery due date in Australia, thus causing havoc with his production schedules. Mitchell's plea was similar to those of Holden's and Richards. Even if the British material was available, the question of suitability was raised by the local bodybuilders. When informed of the inadequacies of the British-made steel sheets, Gullett demanded a report of trial pressings by Richards. The report stated that although the British steel, in this case from Lysat, was on par with the US steel for drawing qualities, the finish was inferior. This did not deter the government, though, with Abbott asking Richards to buy from Baldwin's, another British steel mill, rather than Lysat. Richards replied that they had already done that and the results were just as bad. To compound the problem was the increased cost. The British steel was £2 per tonne higher than the US product, adding between 20 shillings and 25 shillings per body. Added to this, to abide with the government's wishes to use British steel, the need to alter tooling at a cost for Holdens of £15,000. Again, the government refused to issue licences. Gullett resigned, handing the problem to the new incumbent for Customs, Thomas White. In a letter to White, Lawrence Hartnett, the managing director of Holdens, outlined the situation, making it clear that the trade diversion policy was making a negative impact on his business. While Holden's approach was to keep the issue quiet, specifically by not speaking to the press, Richards did the opposite. In July 1937, newspapers began to report layoffs in the motor body building industry due to material shortages. White's response was that he was not surprised to hear that they blamed the government. Richards' response was that White's statement was bunkum and laid the blame on the government trade policy. When White claimed that Richards and Sons was under US enthrall, Claude Richards, managing director, wrote to the Prime Minister crying libel. White was unapologetic and the two continued to trade barbed letters. However, on July 16, 1937, White relented and announced that the steel sheets for motor bodies may be freely imported. The reason behind the government's resistance can be found in a cabinet paper prepared by White. Any change to duties could create a precedent and that then would lead to a reduction in tariff revenue. As a postscript, the announcement of local manufacture of suitable sheet steel for body panels made in 1936 came to fruition in January 1939 at Port Kembla. Gullett had cited the trade diversion policy as the deciding factor in the decision. The introduction of the turret-top all-steel body design proved problematic for Australian motor body builders. The impact of the British armament program and British steel mills' inability to make the new larger size sheets at a sufficient quantity forced the local manufacturers to their US suppliers. However, these were greatly restricted by the federal government's trade diversion and preferential trade policies. Despite numerous remonstrations by the local bodybuilders, the government refused to move until finally it had no choice but to accept the inability of British steel mills to supply and allow steel from US firms after much angst with the Australian motor bodybuilding industry. Thank you.
So, as they say, everything old is new again. It's interesting when you pick up on these sort of recurring themes. Time now well in our past, but still resonates. So, questions? Anyone out there with a turret top Chev that needs replacement? Down the end. Florian.
Thanks. So the process you described with the trade policy coming in happens, I mean, especially like the 1930 to 30, I think Ottawa was in 32, happens during essentially the Great Depression. It is essentially a reaction to trade policy by the Americans and others during the Great Depression. So your story is then set in like 36, like later on. What role does essentially the Great Depression have in that kind of like story? It's like, is there kind of like an impact that Australia basically just ignores what the rest of the world does? Or is it a sense that like that the international steel firms in Britain, in the US, that they actually caught out in the Great Depression in terms of production, and that might have an influence on what is actually there as supply in the market?
The impact of the Depression was obviously substantial, and the reaction, as we saw today, is that the British Empire created the trade bloc, what was essentially a trading bloc, for want of a better term. That was basically so they could fight against the impact of the US. primarily, and Germany, because both those countries were substantially large traders. Now, of course, when you've got an empire, it's quite advantageous because it's so large and has so many people as markets that you can create this trading bloc. So it was a reaction partly for that, but as we saw before, is that the concept of this imperial preferential trade came much, much earlier. And it has been, they were even talking about it in the late 19th century. It does fit in very well with the framework of the Depression. The only problem is that once the Adolf Hitler got into power in Germany, and then the rearmament craze sort of kicked in the sort of like mid to late 30s, is the British military was so far behind that they prioritised everything towards their military. So this type of material was going to build trucks. Now, the British themselves were a mechanised army, unlike the Germans and the Americans as well. They had trucks for everything. So all the infantry, all the soldiers went in a truck. The Germans would walk everywhere. That's a pretty standard European kind of thing. Now, when you have so much finite materials to be able to make this, the priority was always going to be the home markets. Now, this is sort of like the dilemma for Australia as well, is that we're building cars here and assembling cars which were really for Australian markets, which weren't British. British cars weren't great in Australia. They were great in Britain, but the Chevs and Pontiacs and Buicks and Studebakers, they were better for Australia. Bigger engines could last longer, drive over terribly rutted roads in the country. So the demand for Australian-built cars, which were on American designs, were really high. And by this stage, Holden's was actually owned by General Motors. General Motors bought Holden's. I mean, there was a merger as a company, but basically General Motors had a whole lot of money in Australia, which they didn't know what to do with. Because at the Depression, when the Depression kicked in, this is another side effect, the federal government seized all international transfers of funds. So all the profits which GM had in Australia, they couldn't remit home. They had to stay here. So what do? If you're a big company, you don't have capital doing nothing. It's worthless. It's got to do something. So the idea was that they had to either get it home, which they couldn't, or use it in Australia. So one man was sent over from America who said, right, have a look at what you can do. Our biggest customer in Australia is Holden's, because they were doing all the work for GM, like all of it, which was massive. Like it was 80% of the Australian market, thereabouts. So they came over there and they said, look, we've got this cash. Holden's was in strife because they went from being the biggest, as I said previously, the biggest motor body builder outside of North America to suddenly losing from 20,000 staff down to about 3,000. That was the impact of the Depression. It was phenomenal. Now, Holden's, as a family, in their defence, tried to keep their staff on for as long as possible. So during the Depression, they built things like filing cabinets because they used their materials available. They made clothing, they made leather, back to leather goods as well. Though probably the most interesting thing is their range of golf clubs. They had a foundry, so what do? You cast golf clubs. So amongst all of those things, they couldn't keep all their staff on, so they had to retrench, and they retrenched over 3/4 of their staff, which is quite phenomenal when you think about it. So when comes in here is that the idea of building cars for consumption was going to be based on GM's thing. So GM said, right, well, we'll buy Holden's. That's what it was. It worked out very well. Holden's people, staff knew what GM needed. So they could, once things picked up after Depression, sort of slowed down a little bit, those people were just re-employed, basically. GM then had a company in Australia which is where their capital was being used. And very quickly they become very profitable again. The only thing with that is when your demand goes up and you can't get these materials, you've got to get from somewhere. And these people are using best practices. Holden's and Richards spent a lot of time, both at all levels, fathers, sons, grandsons. Sorry, it was all blokes in those days. They went overseas. Every generation went overseas to look at best practices. They didn't go to Britain for best practice for motor car manufacturing. They went to the United States, the home of mass production. So they go to Ford, they go to GM, they go to those plants and see how those cars are made. And they brought them back and they put them in Australia. So when I said before about the scheduling problems of having material problems, this is not just in time. You're waiting for a boat to send over this sheet steel from the other side of the world, which can take months, and you've got a schedule for that. So that's a headache, which, there's globalisation, but it's a headache which we can't, in a way, can't understand. Actually, probably the last few years we've had a few little supply chain hiccups, but just to remind us what it's really like. So for those supply managers, that must have been a nightmare, thinking that they would have to stand down, like at Woodville, they'd stand down 10,000 people in one day. So they'd go right up to work and they say, don't come back to work tomorrow. That's it. You're not being paid, remember, you get paid for what you work. So you go home and we'll give you a call. So it was based around that. Well, that's a very long way of getting around it. There's lots more. I've got plenty to say about this, as you can guess. But yeah, so the trading bloc was based around, it was another reaction to the Depression, yeah. But this proved our interaction between both Britain and the United States.
Justin, obviously we haven't got to the World War II. Section. Obviously, everyone tooling up for war machines. Did the car industry pretty well stop for a while, or were they working on excess steel? And did that force our government to say, well, we're going to get our steel mills up to making our own stuff?
Look, that's a good question. Holden's transferred, and Ford also had an assembly plant in Melbourne. And then Geelong. They transferred all their stuff over to military production. So in Adelaide we had 3 Holden plants. So everyone probably knows Woodville. This is before Elizabeth, this is in the 50s. So we had Woodville, which is the main one. Then we had a Birkenhead assembly plant, which was only knocked down probably about a decade or so ago, which is across the ridge on the left-hand side if you're heading towards the outer harbour. And the other one was in Beverley. So the Beverley plant started making anti-tank guns, which was reverse engineered by the Holden's engineers. So they just got an anti-tank gun from Britain and then looked at it, pulled it apart and then built it. So they did that within 3 months. No drawings at all. They built it. Now that Holden's also, and Rietveld, which is a manufacturer in Melbourne, they did work on the 25-pounder artillery piece. That was done with, actually from plans, but they did reverse engineer a gun as well. The plans were smuggled out through the United States, which of course was a neutral country at the time, not a belligerent. So they got smuggled through to Australia. So Holden's at the Birkenhead plant made boats, torpedoes, and canvas things like hoods for boats, also putties for the bits goes to the bottom underneath between your knee and your top of your boot, so like gaiters, so also putties. And then at Woodville they made primarily munitions, so there was lots and lots of bullets and bombs made there. But they also made other things like crates, like timber crates and stuff like that. No cars were built. Basically, there was a handful of cars made. In Woodville, there was a plant, Holden's had a plant in Melbourne as well, and they assembled vehicles like what that's called CKD, complete knockdown, where you make a car, all the bits of it, you don't put it together, you put it in a box, send it overseas in a boat, gets an assembly plant, and they put it all together. Again, down near Port Adelaide, there was an assembly plant down there, which was now, I think it's now Hardy's own that building. That was an assembly plant for CKDs from the 1920s until the 1950s. So things like ambulances, trucks, stuff like that. So there was very few cars made. Yep.
Just a general question. What did tube makers have to do with all of this? As in tube makers, the factory, I think, in Kilburn. But just a general comment before you answer that. Our Rotary Club actually had Holden as one of our early members. And we used to meet at the Woodville plant, because not often, but part of the thing with the Rotary Club of Adelaide in the early days was to meet at various places of business, and Holden's was one of those. And so that's just a bit of background to that. But also just another comment was it's quite ironic as things come around in circles, and General Motors was actually quite, as you know, quite being an American company, quite strong in the war effort, but also Mitsubishi. So when we had Mitsubishi here in Chrysler, and it's like back to instead of being during the war, it was sort of peacetime. Anyway, so my general question was really about tube makers and what did it have to do with British
tube makers didn't exist in South Australia until after the war, as BTM, as British tube mills. So they were brought in by Playford as part of the post-war development. So Australia has always suffered as being, as we're probably well aware, as a primary producing country, where we really have been, again, this comes back to this preferential trade system by the British, or the British Empire, is that all our wheat goes somewhere else to be made into something and then comes back to us. Or our wool goes elsewhere, comes back to us as our worsted shirts or jackets and things like that. Now, early on in the 20th century, there was a number of royal commissions, and South Australia had a royal commission into secondary industry in 1924, and the very first witness was a Holden. And he said, well, we can do this, and I'm proof of it, because by then he'd actually started making car bodies, quite a lot of them. And in fact, he divested in 1923 their leather goods company. They sold it finally, which used to make handbags and stuff like that, to Harris Scarfs, believe it or not. So that post-war period was the generation of secondary industry, and Playford did that. He stole, for instance, Actal, which like everything down the bottom of Torrens Road, Actal, Email, Westinghouse, Holden's. A lot of that was built because of that post-war prosperity. So tube makers were encouraged. They were going to open up in Sydney, and Playford got involved and convinced them to open up here. Holden's also did have a little say in that too. That's all sort of post-war secondary industrial development.